Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. This particular vlog is about how you can avoid becoming a corrupt asshole, or at least do your best to become less of a corrupt asshole. Now, have you ever wondered why the world often seems to be full of jerks and assholes? And of course, if it looks that way to you, uh, that's probably some sign that you have more assholic tendencies that you would like to acknowledge. Of course, it's not really accurate to call someone an asshole or a jerk, but we could say that people on a scale display more or less assholic tendencies to be more accurate. Now, how do assholes develop? How do jerks develop? How can people become fundamentally corrupt? What's the process? Now, as with everything else, I'm not going to pretend to have a full answer or a full understanding of these topics, but I would like to point to a key distinction that if you understand it, if you watch out for it, will help you to likely become less of a corrupt asshole. So the thing is, I'll start off with a story. I had a client a few years ago who was intensely jealous. He would follow his fiancee around. He would spy on her. He would check her email. He would check her phone. He would yell at her, cuss at her, accuse her of infidelity, while at some level being perfectly clear that there was really no evidence whatsoever that she was having an affair or doing anything behind his back. As a matter of fact, he never found any proof of it. But that didn't stop him from continuing displaying these assholic tendencies. So after a while, he kind of realized that he turned into a psycho and that it was time to do something. So he ended up in my office. Not too psychologically oriented, not too philosophically inclined. Um, had a background as an athlete, so he was used to tough training. He was used to gritting things out. He was used to setting goals and accomplishing them. So I explained to him cognitive dissonance without really using that term. Now, the whole idea behind cognitive dissonance is that since we have a tendency to not see thoughts as thoughts, we live with this illusory identity of being a separate self and there being separate others at the level of experience. This of course is illusory. But since we have this feeling of being the center of the universe, there is kind of a press secretary in the mind, a lawyer or a press secretary, if you will, which purpose is to spin stories, to justify, to rationalize, to spin stories in such a way that no matter what we do, we end up being the hero in the story. Everyone has an incentive to look at themselves as good people, as a good human being. We have a lawyer or a press secretary in there who's working overtime to construct other people, to project motives onto people, to project motives onto ourselves in such a way that we end up being the good guy. So everyone wants to be the hero of their own story, and everyone has a press secretary. Now, the question becomes, so if I have an incentive to view myself as a good and as a decent human being, if I bully someone, if I sexually assault someone, if I terrorize someone, or do something clearly unethical, I'm now in a conflict. Because on the one hand, I have this incentive to view myself as a good human being, but engaging in these behaviors that clearly are not. how will my mind, my thinking process, left to itself, likely solve that conflict? By projecting the other person to be a person who deserved it, who wanted it, or who would have done something similar to me if I hadn't had done what I did. This is what happened during the Nuremberg Trials, when many of the Nazis were brought back from Argentina to face justice in the early 60s. The world was waiting for regrets, waiting to see a conscience, waiting to see people who had more than 15 years to contemplate their acts. And what they found was no regret. They found former Nazis whose only regret seemed to be that they hadn't done more. And they viewed themselves as the best people, people who had a deep love for their people, their in-group, who loved their nation and their race so much that they were willing to do the dirty work to exterminate what they viewed as a cancer. So the fact that they had been willing to do that gruesome work was really a testament to how heroic they were in their own minds. So back to my client, the thing is, our minds watches our behavior. So as I told to my client, if you begin to follow your wife around, if you begin to check her emails, if you begin to check her phone log, if you begin acting in this way, your mind will have to rationalize it, will have to justify it. And it will likely, and since the incentive is for you to be a hero in the story, your mind will likely begin to project your wife as an untrustworthy person, as a person who's an adulterer. And the fact that you don't find any evidence of wrongdoing just means that she's even more sophisticated. So the more you do this, the more your mind is likely to project the other person to be that way for you to remain the hero in the story. The result being that you're getting more and more and more and more scared. So what I had him do was that I had him use pure willpower. Of course, I kind of set up an expectation by telling him these sorts of stories. But I asked him to abstain from doing any of those behaviors for 10 days until our next conversation. He came back 10 days later saying that 85 to 90% of his old symptoms were gone. It was kind of miraculous. And he was stunned by the change. He said that the 2 first days were kind of a living hell. And then there was a very gradual release of stress and tension and fear. Now, if you're beginning to catch on, you can see what happened. You can see that when he's no longer behaving that way, the mind kind of watches that and then has a tendency to create a new story, to project a different fiancé, to project a different him. As a result, suddenly his fiancée seems safe, seems trustworthy, and the fear is gone. So this is a mechanism to watch out for. If you begin to understand it, you can use it for good. So there are many social programs that various societies spend millions of dollars on every year. Most of them don't work. Most of them are counterproductive. Some of them work, perhaps surprisingly to some people who haven't quite looked into this, is that one thing that has consistently helped reduce teen pregnancies and teen crime is community service. You might ask yourself, well, why? What would the correlation be? Well, think about it. Teenagers who get pregnant early, teenagers who engage in crime and kind of antisocial behaviors, These are more often than not people who might not feel part of society or part of society, who don't really feel that they're part of a tribe, or they're kind of on the outskirts. By beginning to behave as if they care, by doing volunteer service, by beginning to act and behave as if they care, as if they are part of a community, their mind watches this, and over time, the thinking, the self concept, has a tendency to change in accordance with the behavior. So after a while, you suddenly have a person who has a self concept of being part of a community and a community being part of them. For those of you who have studied developmental psychology, especially Robert Kagan's model, you can kind of see that I describe the journey towards a socialized mind, if you will, a sense of self that where a particular community is part of the self and the self is part of a community. Now, once you construct a sense of self on those premises, you're essentially made up by your relationships. It then makes little sense to do petty crimes. Uh, Now, on the other hand, there are social programs that can backfire. For example, and a lot of them are programs that seem intuitively to make sense, but where the scientific research, the double-blind studies, not double-blind studies, but control group studies over time show that the programs are actually contraindicated, and that is programs such as Scared Straight, where you might take teenagers who have done some crappy behaviors and you send them to a prison to spend a day with inmates who kind of torment them and scare the crap out of them. And they might leave in tears. They might leave, scared and thinking, oh my God, I'm never going to end up there. But perhaps surprisingly, what the research shows is that these people are more likely to end up in jail as criminals than people in a control group. And there seems to be like a boomerang effect here, where people kind of unconsciously attribute the meaning that, wait a minute, for it to be necessary to do something so drastic to deter me from crime, perhaps I inherently have some sort of attraction or am somehow disposed to wanting to move in in that direction. Look at corruption. If you interview people, I've had the chance to interview a couple of people who have been in this situation, who have ended up corrupt. Many of them have started with the best intentions. They might end up in some company, some industry, and very innocently, they say yes to a lunch, you know, or a very small gift, something that seems completely benign. Uh, Once they've done that, their mind will have a tendency to rationalize that it was okay to do that, and then they might say yes to something else, and then their mind will rationalize that. It's kind of baby steps, and then they notice perhaps that respected and esteemed colleagues, do the same. So if they do it, it's obviously okay to do it. Now, as the snowball begins to roll, as the months develop and as the years develop, you suddenly have a person who's deep in the mud, who might be thinking, how on earth did I end up here? This is completely insane. And where they know, where you can kind of reasonably guess that they would have never had said yes to do the stuff they ended up doing initially. But it's these small baby step behaviors where the mind kind of changes its story based upon observing the behaviors. This is what happened, I think it was in the Korean War, where you had a lot of US soldiers who ended up being communists, where there was a lot of speculation and conspiracy theories about, have they been hypnotized? Have they been tortured? Is there a specific drug? And the answer turned out to be a lot simpler, in that once they had been captured, they would be met with, congratulations, you're free. And then, of course, they would be forced to listen to these communist rants, but they weren't tortured or anything. They would just have to listen to these communist rants. And if they tried to object in any way, that would be, not allowed in any sense. You just had to sit there and listen to it, essentially. And then they would be asked, can you offer, one thing you don't like with the American, I'll put free market in quotation marks. It's not really free market. It's capitalism more than capitalism. But can you offer, something you don't like about that system? So they go, yeah, I don't like this and this. Well, could you put it in writing? Would you be willing to write a little essay? They would get the prisoners to do these very small things, just very, very small. And they would get rewards, nothing big, just maybe a soap or a couple of cigarettes or something like that. If they didn't, they'd have to listen to the same rants again and again and again and again and again. And after a while, a lot of people were confronted with the unfortunate reality of, well, here I've written all these things, I've said all these things. Well, I really have to believe those things. There's a reason why I said, well, I really think I am a communist, come to think of it. So this also has some solid implications for how you live your own life. It really shows how important honesty is, how important it is to not say stuff and do stuff that's out of line with your own integrity. Don't laugh at jokes you don't think are funny. Don't pretend to have opinions that you don't really have. Don't pretend to be sorry if you're not actually sorry. By all means, challenge your premises, challenge your ideas, but don't deliberately be a fraud in your thinking. You see, this is a typical thing that I've seen. I've known several people who have a NLP and hypnosis background, or who have had a deep interest in it, and then they start studying psychology, or they end up in the health care system, and they might have the best of intentions, and that they often say, well, I'm going to change the system from the inside, right? Some people might do, but it very seldom happens. Most of the time, this happens in journalism, it happens in politics, it happens in institutions. Most of the time, people become what they despised. They become a part of the machinery. And it starts with a horrible idea. And the horrible idea is, I'm not going to speak my mind. I'm not going to say what I actually think. I'm going to speculate what the professor wants to hear, and then I'll say that. I'll write that so I get a good grade. And then later, when I get rich and famous, then I can say what I really want. But this is not a good idea. It just gets harder and harder to do so over time. So the more you go around being a fraud, the more you don't really express and stand up for what you think and point out falsehoods, the more your mind will begin to reorganize. If you also begin to write stuff and say stuff to get approval that you deep down inside don't really think or disagree with, you're putting your own mind in a very tough situation, where on the one hand, you're the hero in your own story. Simultaneously, you're acting like a fraud, you're lying. Is your mind going to admit to the fact that you've become corrupt, that you're dishonest, that you're essentially being a fraud for social approval or for security? No. That's likely not going to happen. What's likely going to happen is that since you're expressing the stuff that, since you're not expressing your sincere thoughts, you're not being honest, but you're expressing and going along with a lot of BS, the high risk is that your mind is going to start to begin to buy into the BS. You're going to rationalize it, and before you know it, you've become part of the system. You've become one of those people that you used to more or less despise. This also has, and you've lost your soul, so to speak. You've lost your passion, your sincerity, your deeper character as a human being, and there's pain associated with that. This also has implications for how you relate to people who act as assholes in the world. If you put up with too much BS, if you go around kind of allowing people to treat you unfairly, uh, under the idea that if I just give in to this bullshit, I'll get goodwill and I'll get treated better lately, that might happen, but likely not. You see, people who treat you unfairly, they are the hero in their own story. They will have to justify cheating on you, abusing you, uh, attempting to put you down constantly, taking credit for your work, whatever it might be. They have to justify this in their own mind, so they can remain the hero in the story. So here's the kicker: the worse they treat you, the more they will have a tendency to despise you, to feel contempt for you. You see this, I've seen this with many clients, male clients, who are somewhat wimpy, who get together with women who push them around, and they kind of speculate what their partner wants to hear, and then they say that to get approval to be safe. Of course, the partner realizes this. The partner realizes that this person is just speculating what I want to hear, and then they say that. So they end up not trusting the person. They end up not respecting the person. And why should they? The person, the person's lying. Why should they? And they end up treating the nice guy or the nice girl with contempt. And the worse they treat the person, the more their mind will project the other person to be a piece of shit, that it's essentially okay to treat that way. So, I'm a good person. So since I treated you that way, there are reasons. Here are the reasons. You deserved it. And on and off we go. So do what you can to be more honest. Do what you can to not say stuff and do stuff that you know not to be true. Check your own integrity. Be aware of this mechanism and use it for good. And be aware of it in the people around you as well. I'll give you a final story just to illustrate how corrupt people can get, especially if they have a lot of power and things are unchecked. If I were to have heroes, which I don't really, but if I were to, this would be one of them. This is a human being who I immensely respect his values and his character and his work. It's a guy called Tore Sandberg. He's a former journalist and a private investigator in Norway who has helped reverse 8 wrongful convictions. People who have been convicted for murder where it's later been proven that they haven't. And he's been essential in getting these cases off. Now, I had the chance to speak with him a few years ago, and I asked him the question. I said to him, I'm curious, in any of these cases that you worked, when it's become obvious to the prosecution, to the judges, to the police, to the media, that they have sent to prison an innocent person, often for decades, um, have any of these people offered their sincere apologies? Done anything to help? Done anything possible to attempt to make amends, to make things right somehow? And he just started laughing. Just had this belly laugh, and he said, "Not one person, not once." They would do the opposite. They would attempt to hide evidence. They would attempt to get things postponed. They would attempt to cheat. They would attempt to do anything they could to justify what they had done. There's this prime example, I think, of assholic tendencies of this. Don't quite know the English term for it, but this prosecutor who there was a guy called Leland in Norway who was convicted for two murders who he hadn't committed, and then once he was kind of pardoned or acknowledged that he hadn't done the crimes, I think it was like 20 years later, this chief prosecutor or DA guy, came up on the stand and said, well, okay, he's been exonerated but all this money that the state is supposed to pay him, I think it's more than reasonable to point out that, food and housing in prison, hasn't been free. So he essentially proposed that a large sum of the money he was going to get as compensation would be used to pay food and room, hotel rates, for almost 2 decades. Now, you could make the argument that had his colleagues had an ounce of decency, they would have strangled the guy themselves. you know. But so is this person evil? Is this person just a cold-blooded sociopath? I don't know. I don't know. It could very well be that he's well-intentioned, that he just has such profound belief in his colleagues and himself and their judgment and their goodness that since they're so good and they're the good guys, if they do something, there's really good reasons for it. And then having done these horrible lapses in judgment, having behaved in this way for such a long time, his mind has probably rationalized the behaviors in such a way that he's probably not even able to or capable of seeing the madness of his own behavior. He's likely still the hero in his own story, in the same way that the Nazis were the hero in their own stories. Now, of course, I haven't spoken to Anders Breivik, the Norwegian serial killer, but I think it's a very good chance that if you were to speak to him, he's probably even more convinced now that what he did back then was justified and that he really is the good guy. Now, paradoxically, the more you see this, the less personally you will be inclined to take the somewhat assholic tendencies of other people, because you can kind of see the impersonal nature of it. You can see this impersonal mechanism playing itself out. And then there's always the debate, if someone truly believes and this mechanism is playing itself out, could you call it evil? Could you call it assholic behaviors? Well, I'll let that be up to you. I'd challenge you though to give this whole idea some thought. Take a look at your own life. Take a look at your own level of honesty, your own integrity. Take a look at what you're willing to put up with or not. And if you work as an agent of change, take a look at it in terms of how symptoms have a tendency to develop, and how you can utilize this mechanism in your change work. One implication is, the importance of assignments, homework assignments, preparations, stuff like that. All right, hope this was inspiring and useful. Till next time.